Hello, my name is Emily Henderson, and I am a 2L at Willamette University's Law School. I am joining you today from modern-day Salem, Oregon, which was built on the land of the Kalapuya, who today are represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, and whose relationship with this land continues to this day. I offer my gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community on this land. I acknowledge that my university's history, like most represented here, is fundamentally tied to the first colonial developments in the Willamette Valley and other respective regions. Finally, I respectfully acknowledge and honor past, present, and future Indigenous students of Willamette Law School, as well as Indigenous students of the law schools represented here today. I would like to welcome you all back for a discussion on vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. So first, I would like to introduce our moderator, Annalise Parady, who is a social worker with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, where she collaborates with attorneys to serve men, women, and children in immigration proceedings. She has been with the Florence Project since 2017. At FIRRP, Annalise has worked with adults and children in detained and released settings, as well as trained attorneys in trauma-informed lawyering and compassion fatigue. Prior to working at the Florence Project, she worked with Project Citizenship, providing legal services for the citizenship process, and also with the Massachusetts Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health's Wellness Worker Center. She's an alumna of Boston College School of Social Work with a focus in trauma and immigration. The first of our panelists today is Violeta Chapin, who teaches at the Criminal and Immigration Defense Clinic at the University of Colorado Law School in Boulder, Colorado. She and her students represent non-citizen clients that are navigating both the criminal and immigration legal systems, defending clients in both state criminal court and federal immigration proceedings. Professor Chapin and her students are also supporting and defending undocumented students and other members of our immigrant community as the uncertainty around DACA, temporary protected status, and other immigrant-related programs continues. Professor Chapin joined the Colorado law faculty in August of 2009 after serving for 7 years as a trial attorney with the Public Defender Service of the District of Columbia. As a public defender, Professor Chapin represented both adults and juvenile clients charged with serious felony level crimes and defended their constitutional rights against the government. Professor Chapin attended college at Columbia University in New York City and received her law degree from New York University School of Law. Our next panelist is Cindy Liou, Esquire, who is the State Policy Director at Kids in Need of Defense, a national nonprofit serving unaccompanied immigrant children. She has also served as the Deputy Director of Legal Services at KIND. Previously, she was the Director of the Human Trafficking Project at Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, where she represented survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and elder abuse, and co-counseled civil litigation cases on behalf of trafficking survivors. She continues to author, consult, and train on topics like human trafficking and multidisciplinary collaboration to support survivors. She's the recipient of the Freedom Networks USA 2018 Paul and Sheila Wellstone Award and the 2013 San Francisco Collaborative Against Human Trafficking Modern Day Abolitionist Award for Policy and Advocacy. She previously practiced at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, PC, and is a graduate from the Stanford Law School and University of Washington. Last, we have Michele Roland-Schwartz, who is the Executive Director of the Oregon Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force, a statewide nonprofit whose mission is to improve the response to and prevention of sexual violence in Oregon. She began her domestic and sexual violence advocacy in 1998 in rural Lane County, and more formally as an advocate at Oregon State University in the Women's Center program. She has served survivors in rural Oregon, East Tennessee and Appalachia, and Southern Arizona, where she led the county sexual assault response team. Michele earned her BA at University of Oregon and her MA at Oregon State University. She is vice chair of Oregon Sexual Offense Treatment Board, serves on the Oregon DOJ Crime Victim and Survivor Services Division Advocacy Advisory Committee, and leads policy advocacy at SATF. Michele lives in Keizer, Oregon with her family, where she serves on the Keizer Public Arts Commission and the Chariot Citizen Advisory Committee. Now I'd like to hand things over to Ms. Parady for this incredible panel.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here and for you all to hear from these panelists. First, before we begin, I wanted to give the opportunity to just ground us in a definition of trauma, a definition of vicarious trauma before we head into our discussion. One of the reasons I'm so excited to be here today is, as mentioned in my intro, I work with attorneys every day on trauma-informed lawyering and on vicarious trauma. And I work with a team of social workers. Again, I say we're working towards trauma-informed lawyering. We do acknowledge that sometimes the systems we're in don't allow us to get all the way there. But one thing our social workers at the Florence Project reflect on often is that in law school, you all aren't getting a class on trauma. You're not learning what might be going on in the brain of someone having a traumatic experience. But at the same time, as attorneys, you often encounter people at some of the hardest and worst times of their lives when they might be going through a traumatic experience. So I did want to give us that foundation and that baseline before we move into our discussion. So trauma can be difficult to define, but one way to think about it is that it is an event in which we are rendered helpless by an overwhelming force. And that force can be something that threatens our life, our bodily integrity, or our essential sense of safety. And that can either be a single event, a big event, a big moment, or that can be sustained, continued, and repetitive over time. If it falls in the latter category, it certainly can include anything that threatens us because of who we are as a person, and threatens our safety because of who we are as a person. So that could be repeated encounters with racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. And that can be cumulative over time, and those can be some varied experiences with trauma. I'll take that moment just to share really quickly that this panel is going to, we want to dig deep on this subject, and so we might be talking about some sensitive topics. I do want to acknowledge that many of us here carry traumatic experiences. Many of them often relate to the work that we do or to this discussion. So if you're feeling stirred by that, please feel free to, step away from your computer or, take a moment from the panel to observe what came up in you and do some self-soothing activities. So with that being our understanding of what trauma can be, then the definition of vicarious trauma is when we start to have trauma symptoms as a result of hearing someone else's story and someone else's experience. Vicarious trauma can often be cumulative, and it can be the result of hearing these stories repeatedly over time, such as when we're working in a difficult field. And it also could be when you hear one particularly intense story or one story that is reflective of your own experience that you're carrying with you. That could trigger a trauma response in you. So when we think about being able to observe and know when trauma symptoms might be coming up in ourselves or see when it's coming up in others, I think it's important to know what our responses to trauma are in the moment. And so this is something that's very instinctual. It's something your brain does is direct its energy towards the centers of it that help you survive. So it's very, very instinctual. This isn't something that you are choosing with your prefrontal cortex or your complex decision-making capacities. And we talk about it as the fight, flight, or freeze response. And you hear it sometimes referred to as like if you encountered a bear in the woods, how you're interacting with them, but it actually plays out a lot of different ways than just what you immediately think of when you think of fight. So that fight response, yes, could be a physical fight, but it also is a flooding of the body with adrenaline, with hormones to help you counter whatever force it is that's threatening you. That could be verbal, that could look a lot of different ways. Similarly, the flight response also is probably going to involve a lot of adrenaline and hormones to help you escape the situation. And yes, escaping could be running away from something that's threatening you, but it also could be a lot of mental work to escape an area that you feel unsafe in public, for example. Any way that your body is helping you get out of a situation to survive. And then a freeze response could be physical paralysis, physically freezing, or it could be an internal freezing to keep still, keep calm, in order to survive and get to the other end of the time frame of whatever situation is happening to you. So these are the ways that our body protects us. But if we don't get the opportunity to have integration after that event, or have healing, or to have safety, then those responses could become maladaptive over time, and they could continue to crop up for us in times where we theoretically are safe. Our body could decide that it's unsafe, and some of those could arise, and that can then display itself as trauma symptoms. So I'll go over a few trauma symptoms, but I really do recommend maybe spending some time reading more about the subject over time. So one of those could be, a trauma symptom could be intrusion, and that's any way in which an event from the past intrudes upon your present. So that could be vivid dreams about an event, that could be flashbacks, that could be someone taps you on the shoulder and that immediately takes you back to a time where you were unsafe because someone approached you from behind. So any time in which the past intrudes on your present. There's dissociation, which can be directly related to a past freeze response. And dissociation is a disconnect from the present. It's something that happens mentally. And so if you've ever been maybe working with a client on a declaration that was really tough, that was about a traumatic experience, and it felt like maybe they weren't in the room with you, or it was hard to connect with them, they could have been experiencing dissociation. And it's a way that your mind can protect itself from experiencing something that feels unsafe. And then hypervigilance would be another example. And that is that flooding of that adrenaline and those hormones, but you're experiencing it all the time. And so someone might be really antsy, they might be tapping a lot, they could always be scanning the room for exits, but their body is constantly ready to give that fight response to keep them safe. So some practical ways, and I think our panel is going to get more into ways that you might see this crop up in yourself, and I look forward to that, but some specific ones that you might want to pay attention to and see whether you need to make a shift or tend to yourself. An inability to relax, I think that comes up often in the legal field. That could be an inability to stop working. I also think it's always a good idea to pay attention to how you react to a specific case that's different to how you react to the rest of your caseload. So you can't stop working on one case. Also, it could be that you just find yourself unable to just sit on your couch and watch a movie. You can't keep yourself calm. That could be hypervigilance. On the flip side, it could be low energy and low motivation. Again, that could be you can't motivate yourself to do the tasks on one particular case, or it could be overall, you're having a really hard time doing your work tasks or your daily tasks. That then sometimes, especially in the legal field, unfortunately, could lead to substance use, sometimes to self-medicate those trauma symptoms. So either people might lean on stimulants to get the work done that they feel like they need to do, or might be using substances to bring themselves down, to calm themselves if they feel unable to do so. A really important one that I think is really easy to brush off is psychosomatic symptoms. So I know that a lot of attorneys, unfortunately, end up clenching their jaws and grinding their teeth in the night. I think it's very normal in the legal community, but it actually isn't normal or something that we want for ourselves. So I think that's something to pay attention to. Am I carrying this tension here, and what might I need to shift? And that also could be back pain, neck pain, a lot of different ways that your body could carry trauma with you. So again, our panel will get more into this. I did want to say for self-care, I think some of the most important work you can do is work you do in advance. So once you're experiencing these symptoms, it might be harder to think about what you need. So I honestly recommend taking the time to write down what's soothing for me, what re-energizes me, who are some of my support systems, what are the ways I can reach out to them. Other work you can do in advance is boundary setting. We really emphasize this at the Florence Project. It is so, you are important, and it's so important that you stay healthy and whole while you do your work, whatever that is. And so your clients will benefit and you will benefit if you set healthy boundaries between your work and your life. And then one that I always recommend, if it's not cost prohibitive, I know it can be, is therapy. If it is available, accessible, and affordable to you, it can be really useful to establish rapport and a relationship with a therapist early on. That way you'll have those tools available to you as you enter the field, and then you also have that person as a support if anything comes up. So that's my brief introduction. I do want to move into speaking with our awesome panelists. I'm so excited to hear what they have to share. So I would open it up for any panelist to answer, what is it about vicarious trauma that you wish you had known early in your career?
I'll just start. Hi, I'm Cindy. One of the first things I think that I wish I would have known is that even though I had received training about what vicarious trauma was in clinic and law school, which at the time I didn't even realize was actually pretty like revolutionary and was very new in the field. So in some ways I actually felt like better prepared. Like I've heard of these terms. I actually really had no idea of what it would be like in practice. And I still had a very specific notion at the end of the day that, okay, so you're telling me I'm going to hear bad stuff, but not necessarily the way that how I should handle it and respond to it. And some of it is very much wrapped up also with my cultural notions and being a woman of color here in the US, where the idea is that part of my identity is so much to be the best advocate also means not letting vicarious trauma affect me. Like, okay, so I know it exists. I'm just gonna not let it affect me. I'm gonna be strong. I'm gonna hold it in. You can't show weakness, and I don't want to be seen as soft, and like that emotional stuff that's like pegged as like a female quality isn't getting the work done. It's not a stereotype I'm gonna fall into. I'm going to be strong but not brittle. I had all these notions that were deeply mistaken in that sense, rather than accepting the idea that if you're going to do this line of work, in hearing other people's pain, physiologically, it is going to imprint upon you. And you're going to be living with that pain, and that you just have to accept that. And the question is how to make sure that you are coping and doing that pain management in a way where you're not suffering, because that's essentially what you're doing when you're serving people who have also experienced that pain or trauma. They've also experienced the pain and trauma, and how are we going to help them not suffer and kind of move on, like from that moment, as you said earlier, where that moment is not the defining feature of their life, and it should be the same in our work as well. And our legal system thrives upon trauma. It loves trauma narratives, and as attorneys, we play into that. So our work inherently in some ways does re-traumatize people, and we heighten it because it's part of what we think that has to be done to get that legal outcome. I didn't anticipate that, because even trauma-informed services still inflicts trauma. Even in my current role now in advocacy and policy, there is that inherent piece where even when you're trying to do your best to make good policy, it can happen. And it also happens even when you think that you've stepped back. So even times when I've just done, I said, I'm going to take a step back, I'm just going to do interpretation. The witnessing of it and the people around you that you might be angry at, judges, law enforcement, first responders, medical providers, are also kind of experiencing this together with you, whether or not we realize it. And there's a very different degree in which different professions are getting this training. And the legal profession is not one of them that really has prioritized it. So I learned the most really from working with case managers and social workers, quite frankly. So I'll stop there, but that's what I wish I had known, but maybe, that's just, it's part of the learning process. Oh, and that intake would be one of the hardest things that I ever did. Harder than hearing the very intense details of a case is doing nonstop intake every day and telling 99% of the people who call you when we're at a legal aid organization that we can't really help you. Was really tough, but then trying to convert that narrative to saying, I hear you, I acknowledge the difficulty you're going through, and even just giving the right referral, that it might not solve the problem 100%, but that it's something. So if you're going to do legal aid services or to work with a lot of people, that will be actually shocking. Like one of the hardest pieces is to say no all the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Does any other panelists want to jump in on that question?
Sure, I'll chime in. So I teach in a clinic in a law school. And so I'm a big fan of doing clinic. And I heard Cindy mention that she was in clinic too. And for me, I was a clinic rat when I was in law school. I couldn't wait to start working with clients and meeting people and really doing it in a way that I had thought it would be, really truly beginning to be a lawyer. And I wasn't exactly sure in my second year in law school exactly what kind of law I was going to practice. I was very certain that I was not going to be a lawyer for rich people. But that was pretty much the only thing that I had. And then I met Bryan Stevenson. He was my law professor at NYU. Some of you may have heard of him. They just did a movie about him called Just Mercy, where Michael B. Jordan played him, which was really quite funny. He has long been a death penalty lawyer. His whole life. He started out in Alabama and at this place called the Equal Justice Initiative, working with people who are on death row. So a lot of trauma in that particular kind of practice. And I took his clinic, right? So my third year, I took Bryan Stevenson's clinic, and it's a full year clinic. And we left New York to go live in Montgomery, Alabama for an entire 3 months, for a whole semester. So we were really embedded in clinic. And because that's all we did, it was a 14 credit clinic. So that was all of our law school credits was clinic. And Bryan did a really great job of talking to us about vicarious trauma, and that we would hear things from our client, from our clients' families. And then we were also charged with, because we were writing his, the sort of ultimate legal petition to get him into federal court so that he could litigate his life, literally. We had to go and interview all the witnesses in the trial, as well as all the jurors that had sat on it. And a capital trial is going to involve a pretty gnarly crime. It was a homicide of 3 people in Tuskegee, Alabama. And I wish I had known that really becoming very close with your client and liking them tremendously and feeling very invested in them was a good thing. That even though, right, if something bad happens to them, it will hurt more, but it's better to have loved them, right? And I experienced that very, very strongly in that clinic. Our client, I'll use just his first name. His name is Anthony. The good news is he's still alive, but he's still on death row in Atmore, Alabama, in Holman Prison. And he has become a friend, and like a brother to me. My whole family knows him. We stay in touch with him. I've visited him over several years, since I've now been a lawyer, almost 20 years, right? So I'm 20 years out of law school. And it has been, I think, extraordinarily powerful for me to be this close to Anthony, and to know that it's okay to love him, even though the state of Alabama might murder him. And so I think this whole work-life balance, it is, Annalise is right. We do have to figure out a way to set boundaries and make sure that we protect ourselves and we don't necessarily allow our work to invade all aspects of our life. And so I think that sometimes is heard by people is like, I have to keep my clients at an arm's length, right? So that I don't hurt too much if something bad happens to them. But I have found that loving and liking tremendously most, if not all, of my clients has been a lifesaver for me. That love has been what sustains me throughout as I represent people who are in really difficult situations, right? And it breaks my heart every time I go see Anthony. Like usually the first time when I see him, I cry for a long time, for about 10 minutes. And he's always like, here you are crying again. It's so upsetting to me to still see him in prison. It's very difficult to me because I love him so much, but it's powerful and important for me and sustaining that I do feel that way about him. So I hope that was clear. But that's certainly something I don't think that was said specifically, and maybe I just came to that naturally, but it has been really important for me to have those feelings in order to sustain this kind of work.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really powerful. Anyone else?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. And thank you for sharing that kind of reminder of like the humanity that we have to come to in this work. I really appreciate that. I think in terms of what I wish I had known, I think goes back also to some of the stuff that Cindy was reflecting on, just around this idea that we know that we're going to be exposed to trauma. We know that we're going to have to metabolize so much of what is coming our way and what we're listening to. And I think what I didn't know was the practical aspects of that it's not necessarily even just being exposed to the harms that other folks have caused or experienced. It's also the context of the work that we're doing, how, systemic those issues are, and the difficulty in trying to navigate our various systems. It's more than hearing about the harms. It's also the sometimes limits that we are working within that can be really frustrating. I am not a lawyer. My background is in advocacy, but much of my work has been multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. And so, working with lawyers, working with folks in education and our healthcare systems, et cetera, and seeing the ways in which our systems are often working against us, though that is where I come to a place sometimes of feeling stuck and stagnant. And also what I didn't understand that I, really starting to kind of recognize in our work is the ways in which white supremacy culture rears its head in terms of how we respond to trauma. And so I know particularly for me, like issues of urgency, that we have to like get there faster. And that hypervigilance that comes with that, and then perfectionism as well. I'm a survivor as well, and so perfectionism is definitely something that comes up for me a lot personally and professionally. And so when vicarious trauma and that systemic pressure comes into kind of full force, defaulting to really problematic norms that are rooted in white supremacy culture is really difficult and really challenging and robs so much from all of us. And that wasn't something that we'd ever talked about when I started in advocacy work 20 years ago. And we're only now really just starting to kind of talk about the ways in which it is harming all of us in this work. So I wish I had known that.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts before I move on to the next question? Any other pending? Okay, so the next question is, what are some of the signs that one might be beginning to have a vicarious trauma response? And if you're comfortable, you could share a time in which you started to recognize that with yourself. I'll leave that up to you. And actually, if others need a moment to think, I can go ahead and start with my own, and then you all can reflect for a moment. So I work at the Florence Project. I've been there since 2017, and I was there for the summer of family separation, which we are all familiar with as a truly horrific policy. And I think one of the ways I could describe that is you and absolutely all of your colleagues and all of your clients are all simultaneously, facing a crisis in different forms. And so I think it was truly a really intense and difficult time. And I will share that I experienced a psychosomatic response to that. At the time, I was still working on our adult team, and so I was regularly going into the detention centers that are in central Arizona. And they're about an hour away from Phoenix, and so that job involved a lot of driving. And one day as I was driving to one of the detention centers in the midst of that summer, I started to have back pain. And by the time I was in the detention center, you would often have to wait for your clients for a really long time. I was sitting there and I was like, I am in so much pain. I don't know how I'm going to get out of this chair. One of my coworkers saw me and one of the guards shared an ibuprofen with me. And I was like, well, I'm here, I'm in this chair. I had my client meetings. And then I had to get back to Phoenix. And so I had to get myself in my car, drive me back. And I, let my friends know that I was struggling before I got there, because I'd been trying to figure out if I could get a ride, but it just wasn't possible. And by the time I got there, I actually physically needed help out of my car. And then, I had to go to urgent care and seek medical attention. I'm really lucky in that, I have social workers as supervisors, and so they are thoughtful about all of this and, immediately encouraged me to take rest and take time. And also were immediately able to identify that I was having a vicarious trauma response to the high stress that was going on. But it can be really difficult, and we're not always guaranteed to have a supervisor or people around us who are noticing that in us. And so I think it's really important to ask for time and ask for rest when we need it, even when that was such a high pressure situation that it felt like we need to be all hands on deck at all times. But I obviously wasn't fully able to be all hands on deck until I took a day off to rest.
I'll go next. Thank you for sharing that, Annalise. When I started as a lawyer, I was at the public defender in DC working on criminal cases where people had been charged with crimes, and they started off us newbie lawyers in juvenile court. And so I was in juvenile court for a year. And one of the sort of big major crimes in juvenile court was what was called UUVs, which I learned was unauthorized use of a vehicle. So in other words, stealing cars. The vast majority of our clients in DC, unfortunately, were Black, so young Black men. And in juvenile court, one of my first UUV clients was this young 16-year-old Black male named Charles. And he had been charged with multiple UUVs in his area of DC. And I got to know him pretty well. And one thing I learned about him was that he didn't know how to drive a stick shift. And so we had a lot of talks about cars, and I ended up teaching him how to drive on my car on a stick shift. And so I got to know his mom pretty well. And we resolved his case. You'll learn that I'm bad at this work-life balance. I don't do this with all my clients, but I really some of them. I just, you make a relationship with them and then you hang out with them. And I really, and he was so young, and he was living with his mom. He was an only child. His mom was a single mom. She was awesome. She was so sweet. She worked at the Department of Labor, which was just right near our office. So I would sometimes see her on the subway. So I knew Charles for about 7 or 8 months and taught him how to drive, like I said, and handled his court cases. Juvenile matters were resolved. But then Charles was killed, and he was so young. And that was the first time where I was like, I can't be a lawyer anymore because this is way too hard. And I was so sad. And I was dreading calling his mom, talking to his mom. I knew that I was gonna have to call her and do that because I didn't want to witness her pain, right? But it was very grounding and important and powerful to call her, to do that hard thing, to witness her pain. Obviously, I was in a lot of pain. I was super upset about it. I was so sad, but she was absolutely devastated, as you can imagine. And I then stopped being able to sleep well. I had always been a champion sleeper. And after Charles was killed, I didn't sleep very well for a couple of months. And I needed to learn, almost to relearn how to get to sleep and figure out that. And now I know, right, when I don't sleep well, I went back to being a champion sleeper after a while, but whenever I wake up and can't go to sleep or wake up in the morning, it's usually because I'm thinking about work and something related to clients. And so I've been very I've learned how to meditate. That's been very important to get myself to be able to relax and clear my mind and get to sleep. So that particular response for me was so, because it's disruptive, obviously, not to be able to sleep, and I don't do well at work when I don't sleep well, but also know that you will have these vicarious trauma responses because you will witness terrible things happening to clients, and learning how to deal with them has been very important to me, being able to continue to survive this particular work, which is so rewarding as well in so many ways. I wouldn't want to be doing any other kind of work. And I remind myself of that all the time.
Thank you, and I appreciate you sharing. I think changing sleep patterns is certainly one of those signals to watch out for, whether you suddenly sleep a lot or suddenly can't sleep. I think that is definitely a tell. And thank you for sharing that story.
I'm happy to share as well. I think signs for me, I think it's been cyclical. I mean, I don't think, first off, that I figured all of this out. And I think we continue to figure out what works for us over time. And definitely over time have had more self-awareness about when this work is impacting me. And so I can think of like many different points over the last, 20 years that things have popped up. I recall being on the beach with colleagues once. We're at a conference, and it was like after the conference we ran to the ocean just to be together. And at one point we had a conversation about like how many survivors on the beach, and we were having this conversation as if it was just like a normal thing to wonder like how many survivors were there, and then kind of realized that all of us collectively were so impacted by the work. Of course, we had to kind of unpack that, but being in different spaces and kind of wondering who has experienced trauma or having this kind of skewed perspective of the world. This work definitely shifts that, and so being mindful and having that self-awareness for me has been really important. And I know when it's popping up, when cynicism. I know, Annalise, you talked earlier about addictions, and certainly there's substance use, but there's also things like our telephone, social media. What are other ways in which each of us escapes that are not necessarily the healthiest habits? And so I can tell my hypervigilance like kicks into gear, and I might be a little bit more impulsive. And tethered to my cell phone, tethered to social media, et cetera, in ways that are really problematic. And so having that self-awareness to maybe take a month-long break, doing those sorts of things to kind of tend to other addictions that we don't necessarily think about beyond substance abuse, that I think are really important for each of us, and knowing again that like the way this impacts us is cyclical, and it pops up when we least expect it. And so having that self-awareness over time, I think is really important, or at least it has been for me.
Thank you, Michele. I think two really good points that you raised was that cynicism or shifting of worldview. That is a strong element of vicarious trauma, is that this cumulative hearing these stories and sharing these experiences with clients over time can shift how we view the world. And that cynicism is a big element of it. And then you're so right about social media and computers. I think one element of family separation that I think is similar to a lot of kind of national crises that we're having right now is that when we got off work, you would go on social media and everyone was posting on social media. And at times I had this need to be like, you have this wrong. Like you're saying the wrong thing about, because you're facing it every day. And so it's really hard to see family and friends have such a skewed vision of it, whether sometimes people who really wanted to help or cared about the crisis. And so I think setting those limits there is really important. Any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing. It's clear that we all have very intense experiences and memories, because your body remembers, right? And you remember those moments of time of how you felt, and then, or at least it feels like a very vivid memory in front of you, these hard times. I'm not proud to say the way that I understand when I'm having a vicarious trauma response, but this is the reality, which is oftentimes one of the first things I would remember is feelings of intense irritation at my own clients, and starting to kind of, be curt or rude, or thinking like, why don't they get it? And kind of really feeding into the problem to begin with, which is that people are often unheard, and they are coming to you in need of, during like vulnerability, with their fears, with their hopes. And usually that was a sign of burnout also, on top of vicarious trauma. And that was something that I didn't always understand or tease out, because I thought that the vicarious trauma, I can handle hard stories, but if you are confronted with a large caseload and this perception of feeling that you don't have enough resources or time, which is, I think, most people in this kind of work, just the way that the structures are, they really feed into each other. And then you find yourself at a place, as Michele is saying, that cyclical like feeling actually crops up a lot sooner than you realize. So you think you've done something, managed to take vacation, and then the feeling starts coming back again sooner. I remember working with a client who was a domestic violence survivor, one of the first cases I worked on, and her husband had committed all this terrible credit card fraud and opened all these credit cards in her name. And it was just it was very difficult to work on this case because of the financial institutions involved. And then she came one day, and I realized that she had opened a few more credit cards at these clothing stores to buy clothes for herself and her children. And I just remember feeling really upset that like I'd been working so hard to clear the other debts. And I don't even remember what I said, but I don't even remember it being a hard conversation. But about a month later, I was actually looking at her therapy reports as part of her legal case. And I noted in it that she had actually told her therapist that I had made her feel really bad. And I just remember feeling really awful that I didn't even realize that I had done that. And again, that it's kind of ironic to feel vicarious trauma from the trauma you're inflicting onto somebody else who had been traumatized. It's this crazy meta world where the mirror just keeps getting reflected. And a lot of other things that I learned too, that has been said here that I didn't understand that I was playing into. It took me a long time to realize that she was also indigenous and not Han Chinese. I also just assumed that she was from China, like I'm Chinese, Taiwanese American, but it's not the same. The dynamics weren't the same. I didn't even know that. I hadn't realized it. I didn't understand her financial literacy, the background, all these things that had been feeding into it. And my interaction with her had pretty much reinforced all the ways that she had been mistreated or not valued by others. So, that took me aback. And then sometimes when you realize that you've made these kinds of mistakes or that you haven't understood things, you kind of spend a lot of time beating yourself up later to think like, why didn't I do better? Which is also not a great response, right? And feeling like also, I remember always feeling like there were times when everything was a level 10 emergency, because I had stopped being able to really process like what was really maybe a level 3 versus a level 10, and being able to assess that. And if you didn't see it as a level 10 like me, that it meant that you didn't care enough. And I remember having these intense feelings of anger that sometimes still resurface. It's like, no, you don't understand, like you're part of the problem. And then this kind of lashing out then on people who are actually good people, or people in my personal life who are lovely people and care, but they don't do this kind of work. And that being not great, honestly, for my personal relationships. But feeling really justified at the time, like I'm just being angry on behalf of my client, but really it probably was a very, a vicarious trauma response on my end as well. All the physical things that people have mentioned, I had never actually drank alcohol prior to working a public interest job. I survived college and law school, and a private law firm job, only to be like at my public interest job, like, hey, who wants to go to happy hour to decompress? Because your body starts to crave those physical like shortcuts for things. I really just, and hyperdrive is the other problem, because I think a lot of us come to this legal profession because of this intense desire to control. Like, if I can be in control and take power, then I can do, and I can make things happen, then I feel really great. And when you feel like things are out of your control, there's this intense feeling of just like hopelessness, or like everything is, nothing is ever going to change. There's this kind of spiral downward. And then sometimes that can also prompt me into hyperdrive. So then I start to do everything and I start to really self-center myself into the narrative instead of how indispensable I am to this work. I don't handle this, and someone's going to mess up the case or mess up the advocacy or mess something up. So really learning to trust people around you and get a team to share kind of the work around has really helped me. Being able to take a step back, even changing my focus on work from anti-trafficking to something else, to re-humble myself, to take myself as centering myself in the narrative rather than really the community and the work I was trying to do, was really pivotal for me to really re-ground myself. And also creating new responsibilities that were actually level 10 all the time, like when your toddler is having some like poop accident. I know this is being recorded, but like really changing other duties, responsibilities, like taking art classes. I had other responsibilities, and kind of side things like that I would note, like something silly is like I started tracking the number of books I read in a year. It's usually a really good indicator of where I am mentally. I'll tell you right now, because of the pandemic, it's not good. So it's a good thing to note, and a small kind of goal to get back towards, rather than, some kind of extrinsic measure that's not just like, how are you feeling today? So just a few of my journey, my narrative.
Thank you so much. I think you saw the other panelists nodding when she brought up the irritation. And I think I really appreciate your honesty in sharing that, because I think that is one that maybe doesn't get talked about so much, but is absolutely a sign of burnout or compassion fatigue. It's really common. And then also I really liked that you noted that sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency coupled with, and I need to be the one to address this situation. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. Before I ask, it's going to be the last question for our panel, and I just wanted to ask the attendees to start sending in your questions for the Q&A. I think we got a couple already, but we are going to move to that after this next question, if you all want to start sending us your questions for the panelists. So the last question is then, what steps do you think others can take, or have you taken once you've started to notice vicarious trauma in yourself? I know some of you have already started to share that. And then if you're comfortable or would like to note specifically for that, any thoughts on how to address it when it's something that might mirror or trigger our own traumatic experiences?
One thing that I also do that's very important to my life and my work is I'm part of an organization called Gideon's Promise that's based out of Atlanta, Georgia, that trains public defenders across the country that are in sort of under-resourced public defender offices and can't afford to train them. So we take the lawyers for 3 years. They have to be very early in their practice. And we work with them, we train them, but we also sustain them and mentor them in order to stay in a profession that can be very challenging, right? A lot of our public defenders are unfortunately in very under-resourced offices, and so they end up juggling huge numbers of cases, right? So they may walk into their office and literally be given a stack of 100 cases and pointed in the direction of the courthouse, and that's like it. And so one of the things that we talk to them very consciously about is learning to forgive yourself, right? That you may not always be able to do everything for every single client, right? You may sometimes get irritated with a client, right? Because there just isn't enough time, right? And you may, miss a deadline occasionally or make a mistake, right? Because you just have this crushing, overwhelming load of cases, and that's not your fault. right? That is a systemic structural problem in the public defender world, which unfortunately exists, right? Which is that DA offices get funded way better than public defender offices do, unfortunately. You know, the promise of Gideon versus Wainwright, and that's why Gideon versus Wainwright is the Supreme Court case that gave everybody a lawyer regardless of their ability to pay in a criminal case, unfortunately, not in immigration cases. But you get a lawyer if you can't afford one. But unfortunately, right, we haven't really lived up to that promise. And so a lot of our public defenders are in offices where they have to be able to figure out a way to cope. And part of that, we tell them, is to forgive themselves, is to learn to forgive themselves. The other piece to it is that, you know, and this was mentioned before, you know, the legal profession in general has a problem with substance abuse issues, right? That those shortcuts, right, to like try to calm down. And some of our lawyers really struggle with drinking too much, right? Or like going happy hour, like for way too often and way too long, right? And we have to talk about that and the fact that it happens. And we do have a lot of very sort of straightforward conversations with it. Like I even call myself a wino. I love wine, right? And I've had to develop a healthy relationship with wine, right? Because it definitely is something that I like to do at the end of the day. It kind of signals the end of the day. And especially now during the pandemic, it's been hard to, because we're always home, that to not feel, to just be like, oh, like there has to, for me, like my glass of wine indicates that the workday is over and now I'm going to relax and hang out with my kids and make some dinner, and it's going to be different from my workday. But that can turn into a problem and into an addiction if it's something that is, you know, causing us to lose sleep, right? Not sleep well because we aren't taking care of ourselves. So I've had to definitely be very conscious of that. And we talk to our lawyers very consciously and directly about that as well. And then finding ways to be healthy, right? To take care of our health. And so for me, when I was at work or whenever there's a hard time, like I get out of the office and just walk around if I can, right? If I can go for a run, like even better, and allow yourself that moment, that personal time, even if you have a crushing caseload, to take 45 minutes for yourself and do something really healthy and good for you. And to really consciously make time for that has been something that I think about a lot and I talk to young lawyers about as well.
Thank you.
I'm happy to share as next as well. I think there's a couple of things for me. One, I really appreciate the work of Laura Vander-Nutlitsky, the founder of the Trauma Stewardship Institute out of Washington, and find myself going back to, she has a couple of publications, Trauma Stewardship and then The Age of Overwhelm, as just kind of reminders of the tools that I have in front of me and that we all have in front of us to, one, help regulate and stabilize our nervous systems. Because I certainly know for myself what happens when that is, you know, when I am not tending to that. Things, you know, everything is urgent, you know, the sky is falling, I have to fix it all. You know, all of those things that just kind of certainly are not good for my physical and mental health. And so I love on the website, they have a couple of free tools, the Tiny Survival Guide. And so it's like going outside and connecting with nature. And if I know for me, just engaging in other activities outside of my work. And so being on the Arts Commission over the last year has been really helpful for me in particular, just to engage and like fire a different part of my brain and think and be in spaces where I am with people who are not necessarily in the work, but then also being in spaces with folks who are in the work and building this kinship system, this support system where, you know, there's a couple of folks that I know I can go to and say what I need to say, and that it's a judgment-free zone. And then also, I think going back to what Violeta said about just like not having judgment of yourself. So much of our cultural norms are rooted in shame, and thinking about the folks that we're working with, like the shame that is just inherent in the experience of trauma and experiencing trauma, but then the shame that we put on ourselves when things aren't perfect, things are not going the way that we want them to go, and also the shame in those feelings of inadequacy that certainly pop up when we are fatigued by the work, when we're experiencing that vicarious trauma. And I don't think we talk about that shame enough, but it definitely, it wears on all of us. So really approaching ourselves with kindness and being judgment free. I think for me, that's something I really have to tend to on an almost daily basis to be able to sustain myself in this work moving forward. And that is not easy to do. Not easy to do. Sometimes I'd just rather get lost in whatever it is I'm reading online, or, I didn't start to drink coffee until my 40s when I took on this role as executive, did not drink coffee. And now that's my go-to, and it's got to be, the tasty kind with lots of sugar, right? And so recognizing that's my go-to, and it's not been good for me. And so, just having that self-awareness, I think, is really important. It is a daily practice.
Thank you, Michele.
Well, I love coffee and wine, so I feel like I'm in really good company here. But I agree, I think we have to be really intentional. And I know that sounds a little bit cheesy or corny, but it's not. I think oftentimes reminding yourself, why do you do this work? Why do you come to it? And having more than one reason is okay. So other than, for me, doing anti-violence work, wanting to support the immigrants' rights community, I also have other things I want to do that are really helping me, feeling like I'm doing, because I can't control that. I'm always going to want to do. That's just who I am. And one of that is, again, this idea of getting more teammates or allies or bringing people into this work. So how do we make it more sustainable and attractive to bring people in? We shouldn't accept a system where we say, you know what, this is the way I was hazed, so you just got to suck it up and take it. I mean, I sometimes hear myself say that, how many cases do these people have? I didn't, and I have to catch myself of this wartime story that's not helpful, because the goal is to really bring people into the work, particularly people who can represent their own community. And that is a really big task to ask other people, because I oftentimes feel, like Michele was saying, shame, this idea, oh, I'm not doing direct services right now, or I'm not doing work that I could be using to capitalize on the fact that I speak Mandarin, or there's just a million ways to always find something that you're not doing rather than focusing on what you are doing. But bringing people in and supporting them will help that, because it's also a big task for people sometimes to feel like that they have to represent and do for their own community, that they represent a large community, particularly when you're a minority, woman of color, or you're representing, again, or coming from a vulnerable community. So being intentional and building that movement, reminding ourselves that you're not alone, you are part of different movements, intersecting movements, is what's always really been helpful for me. So, and then making that space when you find yourself centering all the work revolving around you in that world. When you do that, you will also carry the burden of the world on your shoulders by yourself. So how do you not be Atlas? How do you, again, the reason this is a shared responsibility is because the oppression and the problems have been also, who benefits from that has also been shared among other people. So let's make them share that responsibility as well, back into creating a better world for people. So finding those allies, and those allies can be very immediate also, finding a supervisor and finding a job. Even if you love the substance of your work, finding a supervisor or a place that's going to help you figure out how to prioritize and set limits. Because if you come to this work, it means you love it, and it means that you never want to say no. It means you want to do everything and all the time. So having someone like a trusted colleague or a supervisor being able to help you do that is going to be really key for being able to sustain in that work. And evolving your work and your vision is okay. It's not quitting, because the best version of you, the healthiest version of you, is the one who's going to make the most change in the long run. And change is always going to be really incremental, whether we think about it that way or not. And there's going to be setbacks. The last 4 years have been extremely painful, especially, I mean, from all fronts. But I will tell you, in the immigration world, it's been very, very painful. And if there are going to be setbacks, and we hope, though, that the setbacks are like this, but that they'll, in the long run, it looks like this, that we're making progress. But that means that you also have different times in your life in which you're more suited to do a certain kind of work. Quite frankly, right now, again, I have children. I have 2 really young children. I don't know that I was able to balance myself the way that I was dedicating myself to the direct services. And so I'm evolving my work and trying to build capacity and doing policy that's closely linked to our client work. And then, you know, who knows what the future will bring, and that's okay.
Thank you so much. So we do have some questions coming in from the Q&A from the attendees. If anyone else, any other attendees have a question, please send them in. Our discussion has been so robust, which I love. So we have about 10 minutes before we have to close out. So maybe for the Q&A, you know, like just 1 or 2 people want to jump in on the questions. So the first question is, I think, going to harken back to something that Cindy said earlier that I will reference. So the question is, how does the legal system generally support attorneys and those performing legal services who may be affected by vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue? And how could we improve them? And so I think this is definitely going to refer back to Cindy talking about how working the law is inherently re-traumatizing, which is something we talk about in our work a lot. But if anybody has any thoughts on that, maybe just 1, and then we can go to the next question.
I think we could certainly do a better job of handling this for sure. I mean, best case scenario, I think everyone in this country could use free therapy if they want it, right? So not just in the legal profession, but everyone probably, if it feels like it would be helpful, please take it, have it be accessible. Like you said earlier, Annalise, affordable and accessible. That should be therapy that is accessible to everyone. In the legal profession, and particularly in direct services type work where we're working directly with clients that are having a tremendous amount of trauma, I think it should be provided as a matter of course, right? Like either within the office or support for healthcare that would allow people to have access to that. That being said, I always tell my students that one of the most important things about any office that you're going into is what the level of supervision is. And to the extent that so like what Cindy said, if I think it's really important for young lawyers to have access to good and consistent supervision during the first few years when they're in the office. And offices that don't provide that supervision see both a lot of turnover, right? Because lawyers leave if they don't feel supported and don't feel like their work is getting sufficiently reviewed and supervised such that it may be affecting clients. That's not sustainable. So definitely a good supervision network is really important in any office. And as for all the students on the call who are watching this, that's an important piece of like their summer work that you can look into when you're there for the summer and you're contemplating being there perhaps after law school. Really be aware of what the supervision structure is. And asking that really specifically in interviews to make sure that there's something already in place.
Thank you. Next question, relating to that supervision. What is the best way as a new attorney to advocate for ourselves in terms of mental health with a supervisor who may not be as receptive to these concepts?
That's an interesting question. It is tough because you know, the profession is often still very hierarchical. So the managing up and the educating up is not an easy task. In addition to kind of the effect that it has on you, I also find that explaining how the overall effect on the mission and the clients and the staff is really important. That oftentimes people, you'll start to notice when they call in sick a lot, they're not pretending. It's like you said earlier, it's a psychosomatic symptom. And then what happens is that the work doesn't get done and your clients suffer. Or if you are not able to provide the best version of yourself, your colleagues then feel that from you as well. So I think being able to demonstrate the importance of how to provide like a supportive environment to address or manage these issues. And again, it's managing the vicarious trauma. It's not denying it. It's not giving lip service. It's not saying here's some credits to staff who are not salaried. Like, so maybe if you have it on your off time, you can go listen to a webinar or take yoga on your own time. It's something that has to be built into the culture of the agency, but also what's the effect on the entire staff? And again, your work, the mission, even down to the cost value. Again, I know I'm sounding very technical, but I think sometimes your managers are also put into a difficult task of having to run an agency where they are dealing with little dollars in high demand. So finding the different kind of arguments and making all the dots connect together though, about how it's good for you and the staff and the clients and everything all together might be helpful just as a strategy.
Thank you. And our last question to get in with our last couple of minutes is also a big one. Does anybody have any advice for people who are entering the field with pre-existing PTSD? So are already experiencing fatigue from living through their own trauma, which makes the idea of working with others who are experiencing trauma seem daunting.
I'm going to do my best, and I'm also going to lean on the other panelists for this as well. Knowing, I started this, I'm a survivor. I came into this work as well with, mental health issues, psychosomatic, issues, pre-existing health conditions that are connected to my experiences of trauma. And, finding those things, those activities, those relationships that are your lifeline, at least, and I can only speak for myself, of course, has been really critical to me being able to sustain myself in this work. And only recently understanding those moments when I have felt depleted, when we do feel depleted, when we do feel run down by this work, that many times I've met that with judgment. And so finding ways in which to meet that with compassion and kindness, and sitting in those moments of discomfort, sitting in those moments of despair that are real, particularly if you're coming with these pre-existing kind of experiences, and health and mental health, all of those things, that meeting yourself with kindness, I think, is so critical. And I wish that's something that I had known right from the get-go. It would have helped so much earlier on. And I'm so grateful to the network of folks that I have built up in my life to kind of help me get there. And so I don't know all of the answers. I certainly don't know that the answer to this question. I do know that those are some things that have been really, really critical for me to sustain myself in this work. I don't know if the other panelists have thoughts.
Thank you so much, Michele. I think that was a great response. I think I'll add in, tagging off of Michele and Cindy both earlier, saying that we have to fight a lot of shame around when we're able to engage with direct services. I think that is really prevalent, and I think it's important to remember that your career is long. And maybe right now in this moment while you're healing, maybe it's not like the right moment for you to take on direct services or such an intense role, but you will have time to get to it later. Maybe you dive in, you start to see some vicarious trauma and you need to step away for a bit, and that is okay. And you can always take the opportunity to re-engage later if it's really, really important to you to do that work. So I think it's important to be gentle with yourself when thinking about what work you're able to take on, and especially if it's the work of helping people in your own community. I think Cindy said sometimes there are moments when it's right to let someone else take on that burden. So thank you so much to our panelists. I really am grateful for how honest and forthright you all were. Thank you to our attendees and everyone who sent in questions. We are going to wrap up this panel now, and the Abolishing the Death Penalty panel starts in 10 minutes. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.